my name is Joy Jangdhari. Today, our special guest is Rene David Alkalay. David will share with us his story. It is a true story to be told for generations to come. The gift to survive and thrive is one of the most inspirational and provocative stories told in our lifetime. You will come away with a deeper insight into the universal aspect of the human psyche, and by that insight discover yourself. Rene Alkalay, born in 1941 in Croatia, is one of the last remaining survivors of the Holocaust. Starting his life in a wealthy family, imprisoned in a concentration camp at the age of 1, hiding in the woods, and rescued by the Allies and Tito's partisans, and later airlifted with other groups of the Holocaust survivors to a free zone by Randolph Churchill. This might be enough of a story for most people's lives, but in this story, this is just the beginning. The journey continues to his living as a hidden child in Rome, immersed in Christianity and the life of an immigrant in New York City. The search for self continued for Rene in the Middle East and participation in 2 wars. From there, returning to the United States and founding several businesses, including an advertisement agency in Manhattan, a wellness center in New York City. He worked in the business world and socialized with many of the icons of the music industry, teaching thousands how to have a clearer perspective in life. He learned not just to survive, but thrive. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Joy. It's a pleasure to be on your show with you.
Thank you. Well, you know, this is such an incredible story. Tell us about it.
As you said, I was born in Croatia in 1941. I was born in March, the beginning of March. And at that point, there was no Croatia. There was Yugoslavia, which was a combination of 5 different countries. Since that time, they've split up into different countries: Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and so on. It was a historically difficult time, certainly for the whole world. Hitler was coming to power, and even before my birth, there were many incidents throughout much of Europe with the rise of anti-Semitism, just as there are today, actually.
Yes.
So this became increasingly worse, and after Hitler invaded Austria, my mother, who was living in Austria with my father, she had married there. I wasn't born yet. They decided to escape to Croatia, that part of Yugoslavia that's Croatia.
Okay.
Because no one really believed that Hitler would be crazy enough to invade the Balkans. Invading the Balkans would mean war with Russia, and everyone thought that Hitler would not be that crazy. But he did invade the Balkans, and the German army marched into Croatia, into Zagreb, the city I was born in March, the same month that I was born, March of 1941. So that's kind of how my life started, with the invasion of the country in which I was born. And in a very short time, my first few months were relatively happy, I would say, even with occupying forces, because certainly as a baby, I was not aware of the surrounding situation. I was aware of my mother, my father. But within a very short time, our family became separated. My father was arrested, along with many other Jewish people. The general policy at that point, I think, of the invading armies was to arrest the influential people within a community so that the people would have no leadership, and then the rest of the people could easily be controlled. My father was the president of his synagogue. As you know, my last name is Alkali, and the name Alkali was a very prominent family throughout Europe. It was a rabbinic family. There were many writers, rabbis, philosophers. The history goes back to Spain. My great uncle, Ben Zion Alkalay, was the founder of Zionism, modern day Zionism. So I was born into a good situation, but in a very bad historical period. That made it a very bad situation. My father was arrested, and there are incidents that I know of only by hearsay.
Okay.
But they're rather miraculous when you consider them. My mother was a very beautiful woman with a really stubborn nature, you know, which kept us alive, actually. And she was a young woman. When they took my father away, she picked me up. I was 3 months old.
3 months? Wow.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she rushed downstairs when the trucks were leaving with my father and his brothers, and filled with other Jewish people that were being taken to a DP camp, a holding camp, before they would be shipped out to different places. So my mother scooped me up and rushed downstairs, got a cab. There were cabs in those days. And she said, "Follow those trucks."
Amazing.
And the cab driver said to her, "You don't want to follow those trucks." But that was my mother. She said, "Yes, I do." So he did. He followed the trucks, and he stopped across from the camp, the gates that they had gone into. And she went up to the guard, and she said, "I want to go in there." And the guard said, "You don't want to go in there."
Mm-hmm.
It was a German soldier. He said, "You don't want to go in there." She said, "Yes, I do. My husband's in there, and I'm going to get him out." She was very young. She had no idea about what was really happening.
Yeah. How old was she at this time?
She was 23.
23 years old, with a 3-month-old baby.
Right. So my father saw her, and he waved her back. He said, "Don't come in here." But she persisted, and he finally let her in. So then my father said to her, "So now we're all going to die," because he understood the situation. And so it was a series of miracles. Otherwise, really, Joy, you and I would not be speaking. This was probably the first of those. I was hungry. There were no seats. My mother sat down in the dirt of the compound and began to breastfeed me because I was crying. I was hungry. At that point, some German officers were walking through where the people were being held, and they were spitting on people, kicking people out of their way, insulting them, you know, Jewish Schweinhund and stuff like this. And for some reason, one of the officers, maybe the picture of my mom breastfeeding me struck a chord or something, I don't know. But he turned back and he went to my mother and he said, "You come with me with your baby."
Wow.
And my mother told me that when that happened, she really thought we were going to be killed. Instead, he walked us back to the gate and he gave her some money for a car service, I guess, and he said, "Leave."
That's very unusual.
It's very unusual.
How many times would that have happened? Probably none.
It did not happen.
Right.
So that was kind of miraculous. After that, we couldn't really stay safely in our residence because the soldiers were coming to take people away. So we were hidden by neighbors who knew my family well, and we were hidden in basements, and this went on for about another 8 or 9 months.
Was these German neighbors?
Yeah, no, Croatian.
Croatians, okay.
We lived in Croatia. That's an important point, you know. I do a lot of work with Holocaust groups.
Right.
And that's an important point to emphasize. It's called the righteous Gentiles. You know, we speak about the heroism and the survival of people like myself and others.
Right.
I don't know how much heroism there was in surviving. We survived.
Mm-hmm.
I was too young to be a hero, but we survived miraculously. But I think a lot of credit has to be given to the Gentiles who risked their lives to save Jewish people, because they didn't need to do that. They were endangering themselves, their families, everything. That was really amazing courage on the part of those groups of non-Jews who rescued Jewish people or went out of their way. At one point, however, it became impossible to hide us because they were searching basements. So we attempted to escape. We owned a lot of properties, and the person who was in Zagreb at that point was a man named Count Ciano. Count Ciano was the son-in-law of Mussolini. And since my family had been a very wealthy family, sort of the jet set of that day, they also had a lot of parties throughout the years and people in those days who were coming to parties were dukes and counts and earls. You know, everyone had a title. Today people don't have titles, but it's the same kind of idea. So Count Ciano had been a regular guest in my family home before the outbreak of the war, in one of our homes. So my mother approached him and asked him if he could get us out through the lines of soldiers, because Italy was on the side of the Germans.
Right.
So he agreed for a price. It wasn't for free. So she gave him one of our townhouses. We had a couple of townhouses in the middle of Croatia. She gave him an entire townhouse with everything that was in it. And he assigned a couple of his soldiers to get us to a free zone. So I don't know if it was his fault or not, because, you know, we had these soldiers who were leading us through the lines of, you know, supposedly to a free zone. But instead they dropped us off in a concentration camp. And so we became imprisoned. My father and his family went to a camp called Jasenovac. If my mother and I we were together with her parents, my maternal parents, grandparents, her brother, and my mom and myself. The 5 of us were there. My paternal grandparents, my father's side of the family, in fact all of them, went into Jasenovac, which was probably, the more that's coming out about it, one of the worst death camps, if not the worst of the death camps, because it was run by the Ustashi, the Croatian Nazis. They were a different breed than the German Nazis.
How? In what way?
Well, German Nazis were systematic killers.
Right.
They killed. But the Croatian Nazis and the Ukrainian Nazis were a different breed. They weren't killers. They were sadistic, butchering murderers. They liked to inflict pain. They weren't into just killing you. They were horrific.
What is the psyche of that brain?
It's a certain psyche. And certainly not only Jews died in Jasenovac, Jews, Serbs, Romas died there. But we, of course, were part of the Jewish population. So my father and his family died there. Not both the brothers. One of the brothers actually escaped, got out, and he survived, but he died later in Italy. But that's another story. my mom and I went to a camp called Kraljevice. Kraljevice was a concentration camp that was sort of like an Arbeitslager, a work camp.
Work camp.
And it was run by the Italians. The Italians were not really killing us. I think most of the Italian soldiers and Italians didn't even want to be in the war. Mussolini wanted to align himself with Hitler, with the Axis powers. But we were in Kraljevice. And from Kraljevice, we went to another camp called in Rab. So these were relatively mild camps compared to the death camps. We didn't have food, we didn't have medication. People died of dysentery and of tuberculosis, and they died for many reasons, infections, but they weren't being killed. No one was killing them.
A question here.
Yeah, sure.
Were there a lot of children in these camps? How many children were in these camps, and did they die automatically? Were you just like one of the last, as we were talking previously? You told me about your mom taking you outside. Let's hear that part right there.
Sure. There were some children when I first went into the camp. I was a year old when we were imprisoned, and I was 4 years old when we were liberated. So those years of my childhood were barren years in one sense, in terms of food, sustenance, toys, children to play with, people, music. There wasn't any of that. It wasn't any of the usual things you associate with early childhood. However, there were initially some other children, but then over the next year and a half or so, they kind of disappeared. And I found out later from my mother that they had actually all died.
All died.
So the only child that came out of that camp, young child, was me. And why I survived again is difficult to know. There was no food, there was no medicine. I would attribute it to my mother. When we were in the camp, the barracks were set up so that there was an inner part with bunk beds 3 stories high.
Okay.
And the young children were with the women. The men were separated. And then there was a foyer before you got into the main part. And that was kind of some 2 wooden doors. Then you had a little foyer. Also, the whole thing was of wood with 2 other doors going inside. On the inside, there was warmth because of so many bodies. The hygiene may not have been good, but there was warmth. But that's probably also what made a lot of people sick, the hygiene level, and that may be why I survived, because it was winter, winter and summer for the years we were there, but winter. And winter in Croatia, or Yugoslavia in general, but Croatia is very harsh. It's very cold.
Okay.
Snow on the ground, cold. I was hungry and I was crying. So the women, many of them Jewish women, they had lost their children and they were just trying to survive, so I don't feel a blame for them. But they said to my mother, your child is keeping us awake and we need our energy to survive. Put him out in the snow. He's going to die anyway. Let him die. And so we can get some sleep. Instead of that, my mother slept with me in that foyer, which was basically just wind blowing through it, ice cold, and huddled with me for the entire 3 years that we were there.
Did you ever think that you were part of her survival also?
Yeah, she often told me that. But I really think that huddling together and not being in that hygienic, poor place inside may have been what saved me. Cold has a way of, making you stronger.
Right.
In fact, in my current practice, which I don't want to jump into right now, I often tell people that for health, they should take nice cold showers, not hot showers. Cold does make us stronger, you know. So I think that may have been one reason. I don't know, but there were some psychological reasons or emotional reasons. I had no children to play with. I had no playmates, and
How were
from what I understand from my mom, what she shared, because remember, I was very young.
right?
It's not a personal memory. There are some personal memories that I have, which I'm happy to share. But what I have from my mother, when she related some of it, and she didn't like to speak about it. It wasn't until toward the end of her life, a few years before she passed, that she shared things with me. Otherwise, I would know even less than I know. But she told me that a lot of the time the Italian soldiers didn't have enough food. When they had food, they shared some of it with us.
Okay.
So, but basically what our food consisted of was a half a cup of vegetable broth and a half a roll twice a day. That was it. So people did starve to death. And I was quite thin when I got out of that camp. I survived, but I was just skin and bones. But a couple of incidents happened, I think, that kept me alive, that perhaps keep me alive still. One was we were in the compound one night, and we hadn't gone in yet, and the stars had come out. And my mother pointed, I was 3 years old at the time, so I remember this. And she also reminded me about it at different times of my life when I was a child. She pointed to the brightest star in the sky, which I didn't know the name of it then, but I know now is the star Sirius. That's the brightest star up there. And she pointed to it and she said to me, that I'm giving you that star. That will be your star. And as long as that star shines, you will live.
Wow, that gives me chills. What a say, right?
So I still look up at that star to this day. And when I was a child, she reminded me of that. She would, at night we'd take a walk, she would say, see, that's your star. I gave you that star when you were 3 years old. So I think that sort of helped, you know, not sort of, I believe it helped.
Sure, you felt loved all the time because of the star.
And then the other thing is she gave me a playmate. I had no playmates.
Okay.
And she was a very devoutly religious woman. Not with a bias. She was open to everyone. She was a remarkable woman.
Wasn't she a winner of a pageant, or?
She was. She was a winner of a beauty pageant in Vienna, in Austria.
So she was Miss Vienna?
Yes, she was quite, and you've seen pictures of her. She was a beautiful woman.
Yes.
But more importantly, besides her physical beauty, she had an incredible heart. She had true compassion for people and a great deal of love, and people just were drawn to her. I'm sorry you never had a chance to really know her. Yeah. You would have liked her quite a bit. One day I'll share with you a remarkable thing that happened at her funeral, but that's another story.
Okay.
So she gave me a playmate. There were no other children at this point, and adults weren't talking to each other. The only adult that spoke to me was my grandfather, who would tell me the Jewish mythology stories or Jewish folk tales. So I really had that as images in my mind. But then my mother said to me when I was 3, also, she said, I'm giving you someone that you can play with. And so I had no idea what that meant. But she said, his name is God. And God will be your playmate. And you can play with God and you can talk with God whenever you want to, even if you can't see him. And God will play with you and speak with you. And so I didn't know what it meant, but with a child's imagination, I started to talk to God at that age. And I've been having that dialogue ever since. The only thing I can say is that when you're 3 years old and 4 years old and 5 years old and maybe 6 years old, when you talk to God, some people will understand what I'm going to say. When you talk to God, God always talks back. And when you play with God, God will play with you. Maybe somewhere around 6 or 7, you don't hear the voice quite the same way. So, but I haven't stopped the dialogue to this day. And that goes on, and I look at my star every time I have a chance, and my mom is always with me.
I just want to thank you, Dr. Alkalay, for sharing some of your story, and we will continue this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joy, for doing this, for having me on your show.